When you think about the history of slavery, what comes to mind? Probably the Atlantic slave trade, right? The 400 years, the unimaginable cruelty, it's the history we're all taught. But what if that story was just one chapter in a much, much longer and darker book? Today, we're going to dive into a story that, according to our source material, has been deliberately hidden from view. So here's the central question our source puts on the table. What if the slave trade we all know about was just a fraction of a much larger, much longer, and in many ways, a far more destructive system? What if there was a slave trade that lasted not 4 centuries, but 14? Just look at this side-by-side comparison the source presents. It's pretty shocking. A system that lasted 1,000 years longer enslaved millions more people, but here's the part that really gets you. It left behind virtually no descendants to tell the tale. And that last point, the absence of anyone to carry on the story, is absolutely central to all of this. It begs the question, how is that even possible? To understand how, the source says we need to look at systems that were designed not just for labor, but for total control. This was a way to reprogram human beings on an industrial scale. It was less about enslaving bodies and more about creating, well, a human inventory. The source points to a system called the Devshirme, or the child levy, and describes it as a methodical human harvest. This wasn't random cruelty. It was a cold, bureaucratic process. Just try to imagine government officials coming to your town not to collect taxes, but to inspect the children and select the best and brightest. These boys were then systematically isolated, stripped of their names, their families, their language, and then reprogrammed, turned into elite soldiers or administrators. And in the most brutal twist, they were sometimes sent back to rule over the very people they were stolen from. And behind all that bureaucracy was just immense human cost. The source points to this account, and what's chilling is that it's not from a personal diary, it's from Ottoman tax records. It's just a father's simple bureaucratic explanation for a loss that literally silenced a mother with grief. While some boys were turned into soldiers, many others were forced into a completely different system, what the source describes as a massive castration industry. And the first number you need to know about it is staggering: 90%. That was the estimated mortality rate for the procedure. 9 out of every 10 boys subjected to this did not survive. This haunting line comes from the memoir of one of the few who did survive. He describes the place where he was mutilated not as a hospital, not as a clinic, but as a factory of death. The source uses this to show the cold, industrial nature of it all, and the profound trauma it left on those few who lived. So you have to ask, why on earth would you perform a procedure with a 90% death rate? The answer, according to the source's analysis, is just cold economic logic. The price of a survivor was so high that it actually justified a 90% inventory loss. The high mortality rate wasn't a bug in the business model, it was a feature. It's what created the premium product. And this brutal economic logic went way beyond individuals. The source argues that entire peoples were targeted for destruction using systems of economic pressure and cultural erasure. This was, as you can see, a kind of mathematics of extinction. To see how it worked, the source points to old Coptic farm records. Just look at this breakdown. A farmer gives up 70% of his entire harvest in taxes. He's got to save 10% for next year's seed. That leaves just 20% to feed his entire family for a year. The math just doesn't work. The source argues this wasn't really a tax system, it was a weapon, engineered to make survival as a non-Muslim an impossible choice. And paying that tax, the jizya, wasn't just a simple transaction. The source describes it as a public ritual designed for humiliation, where the taxpayer was actually struck on the neck as a symbol of their subjugation. And this was all done in front of their kids, a form of generational psychological warfare, designed to break a community's will to even exist. And to see the end result of these pressures, the source uses the Zoroastrian civilization as a case study. Here you have what was once a dominant world religion, dismantled piece by piece. Their sacred temples were destroyed or converted, their priests executed by the tens of thousands, their holy texts burned. In just a few centuries, a civilization that had thrived for a millennium was effectively erased from its own homeland. Now, all of these systems were fed by a logistical engine of just staggering scale, a vast network of human trafficking routes. The source calls them highways of death, where human beings were treated as nothing more than commodities. Think about the journey across the Sahara Desert.
According to the source, the average mortality rate for enslaved people on this route was 80%. Let that sink in. 4 out of every 5 people who started that journey did not survive. The journey itself was a brutal filter of death.
And at the end of these routes were places like Kaffa. The source describes it as a human trafficking supercenter. This wasn't some back alley deal. It was a bureaucratic hub, processing thousands of women every single year, mainly for sexual slavery. There were price lists, quality inspections, age preferences. It was an organized industrial-scale operation.
Faced with that reality, what would a parent do? Well, this quote from an old Circassian folk song is the source's answer. Mothers would intentionally scar their own daughters' faces, believing that disfigurement was an act of a mother's love, a protection. It just tells you everything you need to know about the fate they were trying to help their children avoid.
So this brings up a huge question. If this history is so vast and so brutal, why isn't it common knowledge? Well, the final argument from the source is that this silence isn't an accident, it's deliberate. To back this up, the source points to academia. They analyzed the course catalogs at 50 of the top universities in the US. The result? A pretty stark disparity. Over 300 courses on Atlantic slavery compared to just 3 on the history we're talking about today. The source presents this as Exhibit A in the case for an academic silence.
The source offers several reasons for this alleged silence. It points to financial influence on universities, political pressure at the international level, and professional intimidation of any researchers who try to look into it. It also highlights the shocking fact that legal slavery was still around until 1981 in Mauritania. But maybe the most chilling reason is what it calls the perfect crime, a system so destructive it eliminated the very people who would one day demand its recognition.
So how does this all connect? Well, the source's ultimate argument is that these were not separate horrors. The child levies, the castration industry, the economic warfare, the death march trafficking, they were all just cogs. Cogs in a single, interconnected machine of human destruction that operated for 14 centuries.
And what was the total cost? This is the source's final staggering estimate. When you add up all of it, the enslaved, the victims of castration, those who died in transit, the cultures destroyed by economic annihilation, the number of lives lost exceeds 100 million. An apocalypse, as the source puts it, stretched across time.
In the end, the source isn't just presenting a forgotten history. It's making a case for how history itself can be manipulated and erased. And it leaves us with a really unsettling thought. If a story this vast, this horrifying, can be so completely buried, what other truths are still out there, waiting to be uncovered?